What happens when a woman dares to break free from the suffocating grip of her family's traditions and expectations, only to find herself ensnared in a fate darker than she ever imagined? This is the story of Samia Shahid, an intelligent, independent woman, whose only wish was to live her life on her own terms. But her search for freedom led her to a place where no one, least of all her family, could protect her. In 2016, Samia Shahid's death rocked the world, but what truly happened to her? Was it a tragic accident, or was something far more deliberate at play? In the hours leading to her untimely end, Samia's life was filled with complex choices, lies, and betrayals that no one could have predicted. Her story raises chilling questions about family loyalty, honor, and the extreme lengths some will go to when someone dares to defy tradition. Imagine being caught in a web of secrets so tightly woven that even the people you love the most, your father, your husband, are the ones who betray you. Samia's love was not just forbidden, it was seen as a betrayal that led her back to Pakistan, where her past and present collided in the most tragic of ways. But the truth of her death? It's far more unsettling than anyone could have known. Was Samia killed to preserve family honor? Or was there something deeper, something darker, lurking beneath the surface? Stay with us as we unravel the heartbreaking events that led to the tragic death of Samia Shahid. Before we proceed, we welcome you to our channel, True Crime Zone HQ. Thank you to all our viewers and a special shout out to our subscribers for your continued support. Together, we strive to improve and bring you daily updates on both told and untold true crime stories. Please don't forget to hit the subscribe button if you haven't. To better understand the story, we need to go back to understand the key players from the background. Samia Shahid was the center of this story. She was born in 1987 in Bradford, UK, into a large Pakistani family. Bradford, a city known for its rich cultural diversity, was the perfect backdrop for Samia's upbringing, a place where the conflict between tradition and modernity shaped her every step. Growing up in a community that was a fusion of British and Pakistani values, Samia's life was one of constant negotiation. On the one hand, her parents wanted her to embrace the opportunities that came with living in the UK, yet they were steadfast in their adherence to the traditions that had been passed down from their ancestors in Pakistan. For Samia, this constant balancing act was more than just a way of life, it was a source of inner turmoil. She loved her family deeply, especially her father, Chowdhury Muhammad, who had always been the patriarch of the family. To Samia, her father was a figure of unwavering authority, someone whose word was law in their house. His opinions and expectations governed almost every aspect of her life. Yet, despite their strong bond, Samia couldn't help but feel the weight of the cultural expectations bearing down on her. While she adored her father and respected him deeply, she often felt stifled by his views. He had raised her with strict adherence to the values of their Pakistani heritage, but Samia's world was also shaped by the British influence of her surroundings, which offered a very different set of values that often conflicted with those her father held dear. Though her father's love for her was undeniable, it was also clear that his love came with strings attached. Samia was expected to follow the path that had been set before her, a path dictated by family, tradition, and, above all, reputation. Every decision she made was viewed through the lens of how it would reflect on the Shahid family. Whether it was her career, her friendships, or her romantic life, Samia felt as though she was always living under the shadow of her family's reputation. Her identity was not solely hers, it was inextricably tied to the family name. In a sense, Samia's life was never really her own, and this created an ever-present tension between her desires and her obligations. As Samia approached adulthood, this tension became more pronounced. The idea of marriage, once a distant concern, began to loom larger in her life. In the Shahid household, marriage was not just a personal decision, it was a family matter. In Samia's culture, arranged marriages were common, and the process wasn't simply about finding a compatible partner. It was about maintaining family honor, strengthening social ties, and ensuring that traditions were upheld. The idea of love, or of choosing a partner based on personal affection, was secondary. To her family, the the success of a marriage was not based on how two people felt about each other, but on how well they fit into the larger framework of family expectations. Samia knew that as she got older, the pressure to settle down and marry would increase. It was only a matter of time before her parents would begin looking for a suitable match for her, someone who fit the criteria they had set out for their daughter's future. For Samia, this was a point of contention. She had always been fiercely independent, valuing her autonomy, yet she was acutely aware that her desires and her family's wishes were on a collision course. Though she was grateful for the opportunities her family had provided her, the thought of an arranged marriage filled her with unease. Her parents, particularly her father, were already thinking ahead. They wanted the best for her, they said, someone who came from a good family, someone who would bring honor to the Shahid name. As her father's voice dominated their household, Samia couldn't help but feel that her own voice was being silenced. She often found herself trapped between her father's expectations and the desire to live a life of her own choosing. It was clear to her that the very essence of who she was would be shaped by the decisions made for her, decisions that didn't necessarily take her heart into account. The pressure only intensified as Samia reached her mid-20s. The time had come for her to marry. In the eyes of her family, there was no room for debate, this was what was expected of her. They wanted her to follow the path that generations of women in their family had followed. To them, marriage was a duty, not a choice. And in Samia's case, there was already someone chosen for her. Shakil, a distant cousin from their village in Pakistan, had been lined up as her future husband. The decision had been made long before Samia could voice her own desires. She knew the proposal would be coming, and though she had tried to resist the inevitable, it was clear that her objections would hold no weight. Samia's feelings about Shakil were complicated. She knew him from childhood, and while they shared a familial bond, she didn't feel the spark of love. To her, he was not the man she imagined spending her life with. She had dreamed of a partner who would understand her, someone who would see her as an individual, not just a representative of her family. But those dreams seemed impossible in a world where tradition ruled every aspect of life. The reality was that Samia had no say in her future, no agency to choose her own happiness. But the pressure didn't come just from her parents. It was a cultural pressure, one that stretched far beyond the walls of the Shahid household. The entire community in Bradford, many of whom were close friends and relatives, kept a close eye on the Shahid family. Samia wasn't just a daughter to her parents, she was a symbol, a living embodiment of the family's reputation. And so, the weight of her family's honor rested heavily on her shoulders. With each passing day, the stakes grew higher. The pressure to conform, to marry, to uphold the family's values, became a suffocating reality. Samia found herself trapped, torn between her love for her family and the desire to live her life on her own terms. As her family began preparing for the wedding, Samia tried to come to terms with what was happening. She knew this was her duty, her role to play in a larger familial drama that had been written long before she was born. But deep inside, she felt a quiet rebellion brewing. She couldn't help but wonder what life might be like if she could escape the shackles of tradition, if she could make her own choices, love who she wanted, and live as she saw fit. Yet, this was a fantasy she dared not voice, for to do so would risk the wrath of her family, particularly her father. In the eyes of her community, any form of rebellion was a stain on the family's honor, and Samia knew too well that this was a price she could never afford to pay. The pressure was mounting. The weight of it all was too much for one person to bear, especially when that person was Samia Shahid, a woman caught between two worlds, one that wanted her to follow the path laid out for her and another that whispered of freedom and independence. But in the end, Samia knew that there was no real choice for her. The question was not whether she wanted to marry, but who her family had chosen for her. Her life, it seemed, was not her own. And with the imminent arrival of her wedding day, Samia found herself on the precipice of a life she didn't want. A life she had no say in. But the pressure to conform was too great, and Samia knew that there was only one path forward. She had no voice in the matter. Her world was about to change, but the question remained, Would she be able to escape the heavy grip of tradition, or would it hold her tighter than she ever imagined? In February 2012, the decision that had been looming over Samia for years finally came to fruition. Her parents arranged her marriage to Shakil, a cousin from Pakistan. Although Samia had known him her entire life, there was no love between them, not in the way a woman dreams of when she imagines marriage. Shakil was a man from her past, someone tied to her family, but he was not someone she chose for herself. Yet, in her world, the choice was never really hers to make. This marriage was not about love, it was about tradition, family ties, and the preservation of honor. In the eyes of her parents, it was the only path forward, a path Samia felt she had no power to change. The marriage, though formalized in a simple ceremony, felt like the closing of a chapter Samia had never fully embraced. The idea of committing herself to a man she didn't love weighed heavily on her heart. As the days passed and the reality of the marriage set in, Samia found herself questioning the very foundation of her life. Was this truly the only option available to her? Was her fate already sealed by the choices made long before she could even speak her mind? But while the pressure to marry Shakil was undeniable, Samia's heart was already elsewhere. It wasn't with her cousin, Shakil. No, Samia had met someone who made her feel alive in a way that her marriage to Shakil never could. His name was Ali, a man from Pakistan, like her, but one who had found his place in the UK, where he lived and worked. They met online, drawn to each other's stories, each finding solace in the other's words. They shared dreams, hopes, and fears in a way Samia had never experienced with anyone else. Their relationship quickly blossomed into something that felt real and true, something Samia could no longer ignore, even though she knew it was dangerous. Their love was something forbidden in her world. It was a secret, a precious secret that Samia guarded with all the strength she could muster. She knew the risks. Her family would never approve of Ali. The very idea of defying her family's wishes to marry someone outside of the arrangements they had made was unthinkable. And yet, despite the danger, Samia couldn't stop herself from falling in love with him. The more time she spent with Ali, the more she felt a sense of freedom, a sense of possibility. For the first time in years, Samia felt like she could be herself, free from the constraints of her family's expectations. But with every passing moment, the fear of her family's reaction grew. She had lived her entire life under their watchful eyes, their expectations dictating her every move. The thought of betraying them by choosing a path that was not of their making filled her with anxiety. What would they say? What would they do? Would they disown her? Would they go so far as to try and punish her for choosing her own happiness? Samia had always been a dutiful daughter. She had never once questioned her parents' decisions or their authority. But this time, things were different. This was no longer a matter of following a prescribed path, this was about her life, her future, and the love she felt for Ali. Every moment she spent with him, she felt a stronger pull toward the life she longed for, a life outside of the control of her family. But each of those moments was also filled with fear, fear of being discovered, fear of what her family would do, and fear of losing everything she had ever known. As the months went by, Samia's relationship with Ali grew deeper, more intense. The love they shared was something she could not deny, but the weight of her family's expectations grew heavier with each passing day. The distance between her desires and her obligations grew ever wider, and Samia began to wonder if it was even possible to have both, a life of love and freedom with Ali, and the approval of her family, whose views seemed set in stone. She knew she couldn't continue this way forever. Something had to give. But no matter how much Samia dreamed of a life with Ali, there was always the looming question, could she ever truly escape the grip of her family? The idea of being free felt like a distant dream, a fleeting hope that seemed more and more out of reach. Even as Samia planned her escape, her family's control over her life seemed inescapable. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, reminding her of the weight of tradition, reminding her of the duty she owed to her family. How could she walk away from everything she had known, everything her family had built? With each passing day, Samia's hope for a future with Ali began to fade, replaced by a rising dread. She couldn't shake the feeling that her love for Ali was a threat, not just to her family's honor, but to her very safety. And as the tension between her desires and her reality mounted, Samia found herself at a crossroads, unsure of where to turn. The closer she got to Ali, the further she seemed from the life her family expected of her. And as she contemplated what lay ahead, she knew that her next decision could change everything. But no matter how badly Samia longed for freedom, the question remained, would she ever be able to truly break free from the weight of her family's expectations? Could she carve a new path for herself, or would the forces that had controlled her life for so long eventually crush her spirit, leaving her to live a life dictated by others? As the days wore on, Samia was faced with a terrifying reality. Her hopes for the future were in direct conflict with her past, and in the end, the choice she made would determine not only her fate, but the fate of those around her. She couldn't help but wonder if she was walking toward the life of freedom she desired, or if she was heading straight into the very trap she had been trying to escape. Imagine yourself in her situation. What would do? Would you follow her decision? Or you have something else? Tell us in the comments section, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. In 2016, Samia Shahid made a heart-wrenching decision, a decision that would unknowingly set her on a path from which there would be no return. After years of living in Dubai with her husband, Ali, and trying to build a new life far away from her family's expectations, Samia learned that her father was gravely ill. Her love for him, despite their tense relationship, was undeniable. She had always been close to him as a young girl, and his illness weighed heavily on her. It was a call she couldn't ignore. The thought of losing him without being there in his final days was something Samia couldn't live with. But little did she know that what should have been a temporary visit, a chance to make peace with her family, would soon become a deadly trap. She packed her bags with a heavy heart and boarded the flight back to Pakistan, torn between the duty she felt toward her family and the life she had carved out with Ali. Her husband tried to dissuade her from going, fearful of the tension that was sure to rise, but Samia insisted. It was her father, after all, and this visit, she thought, could bring some closure. Samia didn't realize that the very moment she stepped onto that plane, the trap had already been set, by the very people who were supposed to love her the most. Upon her arrival, the welcome she received from her family was a mixture of affection and control. Her father, though ill, was still the dominating figure he had always been. He was pleased to see her, but Samia could feel the weight of his disapproval, the unspoken judgment that had always hung in the air between them. And her mother, Imtiaz, was there as well, her eyes sharp with an intensity that Samia couldn't quite understand. Though her family embraced her physically, emotionally, the distance was palpable. They were glad to have her back, but Samia knew, deep down, that they were unhappy with the life she had chosen. They didn't approve of her marriage to Ali. They resented her for stepping outside the boundaries they had set for her. And although they didn't openly speak of it, their dissatisfaction simmered beneath the surface. The tension between Samia's love for Ali and her family's refusal to accept that love had been growing steadily over the past few years. She knew that her choices were seen as a betrayal, but she couldn't live a life dictated by others anymore. She had chosen her own path, and despite the struggles, she had found a form of happiness with Ali. But now, standing in the midst of her family, with their disapproving gazes and silent reproaches, she couldn't escape the feeling that her past and her present were on a collision course. Her father, especially, was a figure who had never once wavered in his expectations for her. To him, she had gone astray. To him, she had disrespected the very fabric of their family's honor by marrying a man who was not of their choosing. And as Samia's stay in Pakistan extended, her unease only grew. She had hoped that seeing her father would help heal old wounds, but instead, she found herself trapped in a house filled with a familiar but suffocating tension. Every move she made was scrutinized, every word she spoke, judged. Though she tried to keep her emotions in check, Samia could feel the walls closing in on her. She wasn't in control of her own life anymore, not in this house. The weight of her family's expectations was suffocating. Every moment she spent with them was a reminder of the life she had left behind, a life that, for all its freedoms, still had its costs. But Samia had made her choice. She had fought for a life of her own, and though it seemed like the world was closing in, she refused to give it up. But as the days went on, the pressure only increased. Her family's hostility toward her marriage with Ali grew more obvious. The whispers that had once been subtle now seemed louder, more forceful. They tried to convince her that she had made a mistake, that she was dishonoring her father and her heritage. Her mother, in particular, seemed intent on making her feel guilty, constantly reminding Samia of the shame she had brought upon the family. Samia knew that her visit to Pakistan was not just a family reunion, it was, in the eyes of her relatives, an attempt to bring her back into the fold, to erase the mistakes of her past. But Samia had no intention of returning to a life that controlled her every move. And then, on July 20, 2016, Samia Shahid's life came to a brutal and abrupt end. What should have been a routine day, an ordinary continuation of her visit to her family, turned into a night of horror. The events that unfolded are clouded in confusion and uncertainty. Samia's father, Chowdhury Muhammad, reported her death, claiming that she had fallen down the stairs. It was a claim that seemed implausible to those who knew her, but it was accepted by the authorities at the time. The family buried Samia quickly, following traditional practices, and with little question asked. But as news of Samia's death spread, something didn't sit right. Her family's explanation, an accident, a fall down the stairs, began to unravel under closer scrutiny. Ali, Samia's husband, who had not been with her in Pakistan, immediately grew suspicious. He refused to believe that his wife had died in such an ordinary manner. Ali, knowing the tensions between Samia and her family, feared that her death was not accidental, but intentional, a result of the very pressures that had followed her throughout her life. The investigation that followed revealed the horrifying truth. Samia had not simply fallen down the stairs. She had been strangled, and signs of sexual assault were found. Her body, rushed into a hasty burial by her family, bore clear signs of violence. The initial claim that her death had been an accident was quickly debunked, and the investigation took a darker turn. Was it an honor killing, as many suspected? Or was there more to the story, something deeper, something even more unsettling? Though her family tried to cover up the truth, the damage had been done. The authorities began to ask questions, and the investigation slowly pieced together the truth of Samia's death. Samia's return to Pakistan had been a return to the same oppressive forces that had controlled her life. Her desire to make peace with her father and family had led her into the hands of those who believed her freedom was a threat. And so, Samia Shahid's life, a life filled with dreams of independence, came to an untimely and tragic end. The questions surrounding her death, the unanswered mysteries, the lies, and the cover-up, left a trail of devastation. Was her death truly an accident, as her father claimed? Or was it a deliberate act of retribution, carried out by the very people who had once promised to love and protect her? The truth would soon be revealed, but the legacy of Samia's life, her fight for freedom and the ultimate price she paid for it, would continue to haunt those who knew her. As the investigation into Samia Shahid's death unfolded, what was initially accepted as an accident began to take on a much darker and more deliberate shape. In the hours following her death, the initial reports painted a picture of a woman who had simply fallen down the stairs. It seemed like a tragic, albeit accidental, incident. But for those who knew Samia, including her husband Ali, there was something far more unsettling about the way everything had unfolded. Ali, from the very moment he received the news, refused to accept the explanation that his wife had died from a simple fall. Something didn't sit right with him. As the authorities began their investigation, it became increasingly clear that this was not the case. Autopsy results revealed that Samia had not fallen. She had been strangled. The marks on her neck were unmistakable, clear signs of strangulation. Worse still, there were also signs of sexual assault, a chilling revelation that cast a shadow over the entire situation. How could something so brutal have happened to a woman who had always been known for her warmth and kind heart? The answer lay not in some random act of violence, but in the hands of those closest to her. The web of lies, betrayal, and control that had followed Samia her entire life finally came to light. Her family, including her father, Chowdhury Muhammad, and her ex-husband, Shakil, were implicated in her murder. The truth, though slow to reveal itself, became undeniable. Samia's death was not a random act of violence, it was a calculated move, a tragic consequence of the very values and expectations that had shaped her life. Both her father and ex-husband had a hand in her death. The man who had once promised to protect her, the man whose love and approval she had sought throughout her life, was involved in the very act that led to her brutal end. Her family, in their desire to preserve their honor and reputation, had turned on her in the most violent and heart-wrenching way. The investigation revealed that, in the days leading up to her death, Samia had been questioned by her father and Shakil. Her refusal to comply with their demands, her insistence on living life on her own terms, had enraged them. She had defied them, and in their eyes, that could not be forgiven. Shakil, her first husband, had long resented her for leaving him, for daring to marry someone of her own choosing, someone who was not the man her family had arranged for her. The tension between them had only escalated after Samia's return to Pakistan. Samia's very existence in defiance of their control became an affront to their dignity, to their very idea of family honor. In their minds, the only way to restore their reputation was to eliminate the threat she posed, no matter the cost. As Samia's body was examined and the details of her death came into focus, it became painfully clear that the crime was not a spontaneous act. It was the end result of years of control, resentment, and the stifling of Samia's autonomy. Her attempts to live freely, her decision to marry Ali, to divorce Shakil, and to embrace a life outside her family's expectations, had been viewed as a betrayal by those she loved the most. But what should have been a journey of self-discovery and freedom was met with violent resistance. Samia's hopes for a life of independence were crushed by the very people she had trusted. Her death wasn't simply the tragic loss of a young woman, it was a dire consequence of the cultural forces that had always been at play in her life. Family honor, reputation, and control were valued above her desires, her love, and ultimately, her life. Samia's death stands as a stark reminder of the high price many people, particularly women, are forced to pay when their families place tradition and reputation above individual happiness and freedom. In Samia's case, the cost was far too high. The police were left grappling with the difficult emotions tied to this case: honor, shame, and control. Her family had acted out of a sense of deep-rooted belief in their right to decide her fate. Their actions were not simply out of personal malice, but from the intense cultural pressure they felt to preserve the family's honor. Yet, no matter how deeply ingrained these values were, the reality of Samia's murder could not be justified by cultural norms. In many cultures, including Samia's, family reputation and honor are considered paramount. They are often seen as the cornerstone of identity, what keeps the fabric of family, community, and society intact. However, as the case progressed, the investigation raised uncomfortable questions about the limits of these values. How far is too far? How much control should a family have over an individual's life, especially when that individual is an adult capable of making her own choices? Was Samia's desire for independence truly such a threat to her family's honor that it justified her death? These are questions that many in the community, and around the world, were forced to confront as the true nature of Samia's death came to light. The cultural perspective on honor killings can be challenging to navigate. In some families, particularly those that adhere to strict traditional values, honor is viewed as a sacred thing, a thing worth protecting at any cost. But Samia's death highlights the danger of allowing honor to become a justification for violence. The life of a woman, her choices, her desires, should never be subject to the whims of those around her. Yet for Samia, her fight for personal happiness was met with such violent resistance that it led to her tragic and untimely death. The investigation into her murder revealed the complicity of those who were supposed to love and protect her, her father and her ex-husband. They acted under the guise of upholding family honor, yet their actions were nothing more than an attempt to impose control over a woman who had dared to challenge the traditions they held dear. Samia's death was not just the end of her life, it was a brutal and tragic reminder of the devastating consequences of trying to hold on to outdated, oppressive beliefs at the expense of individual freedom. As her family members, particularly her father and ex-husband, were implicated in her murder, the true cost of Samia's struggle became clear. It wasn't just her life that had been taken, it was her right to live as she saw fit, her ability to choose her own path, and her right to love whomever she chose. Samia Shahid's death remains a chilling reminder of the price some women pay for defying the expectations of family and tradition. The aftermath of Samia's murder was filled with grief and confusion. Ali, her loving husband, struggled to come to terms with the loss of his wife, the woman he had fought so hard to be with. Her family, particularly her father, tried to shield themselves from the truth, claiming that their daughter's actions had brought shame upon them. But Samia's story, her death, and the subsequent investigation forced the world to confront the uncomfortable reality of cultural oppression and the lengths to which some would go to preserve their version of family honor. Ultimately, Samia's death left behind more than just a grieving family. It left behind a world that was forced to reconsider how far we are willing to go in the name of tradition and reputation, and whether that price is ever worth paying. Samia Shahid's story isn't just a tragedy, it is a powerful wake-up call, a stark reminder of the extreme lengths some cultures, families, and communities will go to preserve their traditions and honor, often at the expense of the very lives of the individuals they claim to protect. Samia's death was not an isolated event, it highlights a much larger problem, the systemic oppression that women face when their autonomy is suppressed in the name of family reputation. Her tragic end speaks to the cost of cultural expectations and the devastating consequences when a woman dares to make her own choices. Samia was a woman with dreams, desires, and the will to live her life according to her own terms. But the forces that surrounded her, her family, their culture, and their values, conspired to push her into a corner where her choices were not hers to make. She wasn't just a woman, she was a representation of her family's honor, a symbol of their status and reputation. To them, she was an extension of their ideals, not a separate individual with the right to carve her own path. As she tried to break free, as she tried to live authentically, the consequences of her defiance were severe, and it cost her life. But Samia's story is not an isolated one. Across the world, countless other women are suffering under the weight of oppressive family traditions. Like Samia, they find themselves trapped in relationships, marriages, and lives that were never their own choosing. Their hopes, dreams, and desires are stifled by a cultural grip that places family reputation and honor above everything else. Their autonomy is sacrificed in the name of preserving a facade, a structure that may seem to uphold social order but, in reality, breeds violence and devastation. Samia's death is a glaring example of how, when individuals, particularly women, try to assert their independence, it can lead to tragic and unimaginable outcomes. The tragic end of Samia Shahid exposes a harsh reality: family expectations, when taken to the extreme, can become a tool of control, leading to destruction. Family honor, in many cultures, is often elevated to an almost sacred status, where the choices of individuals, especially women, are seen as threats to the integrity of the family unit. For Samia, her desire to marry someone she loved, to choose her own life, to leave the path that had been laid out for her by her family, was seen as an unforgivable act of defiance. This is a harsh reality that countless women across the world are subjected to every single day. The impact of Samia's case goes beyond just her family, beyond just the tragedy of her untimely death. It calls into question the validity of cultural norms that suppress individual autonomy in the name of honor. It brings to light the question of how far we, as a society, are willing to go to protect traditions that lead to the destruction of human lives. Samia's life and death is a poignant reminder of the need for change, change that allows individuals, particularly women, to make their own choices and live free of the constraints imposed by cultural expectations. The question we must ask ourselves is, how much longer will this cycle of violence continue? How many more women will have to pay the ultimate price for attempting to live their lives outside the bounds of traditional expectations? Samia's death was not the first of its kind, and sadly, it won't be the last unless we, as a global society, take a stand against this injustice. Samia's story compels us to examine the damage that is done when the concept of family honor supersedes the fundamental rights of individuals to live freely and safely. As we reflect on what happened to Samia Shahid, we must also reflect on the larger picture. How many women, just like Samia, are being forced to live lives they don't want? How many are being silenced, controlled, and coerced into conformity because of societal pressures and cultural expectations? Samia was a woman with a vision, with a heart full of dreams and aspirations, and yet the love she sought and the life she dreamed of were ripped away by those who were supposed to protect and support her. This tragedy underscores the need for systemic change, a change that not only shifts cultural views on honor and family reputation but also empowers individuals to break free from the oppressive hold of tradition. What do you think about Samia's case? Do you see this as a story of betrayal, or is it the tragic consequence of a cultural grip that refused to let her live the life she wanted? Can her death be seen as the inevitable result of a family's desire to maintain control, or is it something deeper, something more heartbreaking, a failure to recognize the humanity of a woman who simply wanted to live for herself? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. What do you believe the lesson from Samia's story is? And how do we move forward as a society to ensure that future generations of women are not subjected to the same fate? This case is not isolated. Samia's story is one of many. Around the world, countless women face the same struggles, struggling to find the courage to live life on their own terms, fighting to break free from the chains of family and cultural expectations. Their stories, too, are often silenced, lost in the noise of societal pressure and family loyalty. But Samia's story, her tragic death, has given a voice to those who have been oppressed and ignored for far too long. The cycle of violence rooted in cultural traditions and family honor must be challenged. Change must come, not only from the victims but from the societies that enable this violence to continue unchecked. The first step is to acknowledge the problem, to recognize the deep harm that is caused when women are treated as objects to protect family pride, rather than as human beings with the right to make their own choices. Samia Shahid's death is a painful reminder that the pursuit of freedom, autonomy, and love can come at an unimaginable cost. But her story should not end in sorrow, it should ignite the fire of change, the desire to make sure that future generations of women do not suffer in the same way. We have the power to stop this cycle. The question is, will we? If you found Samia's story powerful, don't forget to subscribe, share this video, and keep this important conversation going. Let's bring awareness to this global issue and work toward a future where no woman ever has to face the same fate. Share this story, and help raise your voice for those who can no longer speak. Let's create change together.